Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. I'm hoping you guys are having a fantastic day. So in today's video, as you can tell, I'm finally making my winter forecast 2023-2024. I do believe a wild winter is coming, and I'll obviously explain what I mean by that in this video. And I say finally because normally I would release this, well, probably late July, early August. I always like making early ones, but I just never really found the time to make one earlier this year, and now it is already September, mid-September, but at least I do believe this one will be a lot more accurate than the one I would have made in July. So let's get into this. So first off, let's start talking about the ENSO. So many of you have heard the El Nino and how that will be coming into play this this year, into this year's winter. Now, that is obviously a very important factor of this winter forecast. That is usually actually my main kind of factor at the beginning, whether it's a La Nina, El Nino, or neutral. So what is an El Nino? Well, as you can see, for now, we have an El Nino advisory. Conditions are observed currently in the Pacific Ocean, and an El Nino basically is a ONI greater than or equal to 0.5 degrees Celsius, and if the water temperatures off the eastern coast of Ecuador and Peru are cooler by half a degree Celsius, then those are, and I said eastern, I meant to say western coasts of those countries. And if they're cooler by half a degree Celsius, then it's usually a La Nina. We've had a La Nina the last 3 years, right? So we've been stuck in a La Nina pattern for a while. We went through a brief neutral during the winter, late spring into the summer, and now heading into this winter, we will be most likely looking at a El Nino. And you can see this is kind of hopefully giving you an idea of where this is. We're looking at this area right here off the western shores of Ecuador and Peru. Is initially this weather phenomena, which only recently, pretty much the 20th century, was observed to affect other areas profoundly, and how weather impacts certain monsoons and whatnot, just based off whether or not these waters are cool or warm. And this was actually first identified by fishermen, Peruvian fishermen and Ecuadorian fishermen, that noticed that their amount of fish that they caught varied greatly based off whether or not it was cool and warm. So they began tracking that, and that was kind of like the origin of it. So very interesting. And you can see during the last 4 weeks, the sea surface temperature anomalies have been pretty much very, very warm. You can see through that time frame, and they have continued to warming in the last 4 weeks. You can see this is what the progress is. So it's just getting warmer and warmer, which is again why I do believe a strong El Nino is most likely going to happen. We're already in an El Nino right now, except that for the fall and spring and really any other season than winter, the El Nino impacts aren't as profound as in winter, it seems at least. So notice the Climate Prediction Center, their probabilistic ENSO forecast is for an El Nino. They're at 100%. I've rarely seen, actually, I don't know if I've ever seen it at 100%, which that's what it shows for July, August, September. Obviously, the odds do decrease a little bit, but I'm going to tell you something right now. Even if the odds are between 60 and 70, that's usually pretty still a good chance of whatever that is at that percentage of happening. So if they're at 70, almost 80, 80% all the way into next spring, the El Nino is definitely going to stick around through this winter unless, I don't know, you drop a nuke in the ocean, because it's pretty spectacular. We're going to have an El Nino, and that's pretty much guaranteed. And you can see they're showing its favorite through Northern Hemisphere winter 2023 with chances exceeding 95%, so astounding, through the winter months of December, February. Notice nearly all the models, so we use these type of models to kind of predict the intensity of this. So we know El Nino is going to happen, but we care also about the intensity, because a weak El Nino has different impacts on the United States, and again, it impacts all of the world, right, as I mentioned, but I'm just focusing on the U.S. for this video. So for the U.S., a weak El Nino is a little bit different than, say, a strong or a moderate El Nino. So it's important to know the intensity of this El Nino. And you can see that for the next few months here, the model projections, here's the intensity, right? So 1.5 degrees above, here's 2 degrees above. Here would be the La Nina. You can see no chances of that. One only brings it into the very vicinity of a La Nina into middle pretty much of next year, which again is very far out, and we don't really care about that for this video. Do note that the statistical average has it at a kind of a weak, at a moderate El Nino, while the DUIN average has it as a strong, approaching that 1.5 and even that 2. So the strongest El Nino that's ever occurred was a 2.5 in 2015, 2016, right? I don't believe we'll be having that this year. That is off. That is really not most likely going to be happening. However, I wouldn't be surprised to see this, potentially strengthen even more, and maybe instead of the models showing an average of 1.9, just shy of 1.5, they may end up showing something above 1.5. And you can see this is another set of models, right? The CFS version ensemble 2, and the dashed line is kind of that average. Again, almost a strong. Moderate, I believe, is between 1 and 1.5, and strong is 1.5 and above. So a moderate, or a very strong moderate, or potentially a strong El Nino. Yeah, that's pretty much what we needed to get away from that. Now, I'm showing you this because this is basically, if you click on this blue link, obviously this is just a picture of this, but what I did was I clicked on this right here because you could find the details of how the El Nino and La Nina and neutral patterns have played out since the 1950s, right? And you may be wondering, okay, who cares? Well, what we could actually do, and this is very important in weather, it's called weather analog kind of tracking. So we go back into previous years that had, say, a similar El Nino strength, like 2015, 2016, right? Obviously, this is stronger than what we had this year, but it's still a strong El Nino, which most likely is what's going to happen this year. And we could take a look at their months, right? And what happened during those months. And we don't just look at one year. We look at all of the ones that had strong to moderate El Ninos. There haven't been that many since 1950, but there's been around 7 or 8. So I looked at all of them and compiled their data to see if, we could get a good look of any pattern that's kind of dominated those, I guess, areas. Whether or not, the Northeast is warmer, or any kind of trends and patterns. And in fact, there is. You can see that during the December months of the strong to moderate El Nino years, so of 2015, you can see 2009, 1997, 1991, I guess the average weather pattern in terms of the surface air anomalies was warmer towards the north and eastern United States, cooler maybe towards the south and west, and a bit warmer towards the north and cooler towards the Arctic Circle. Now, December seems to be a kind of outlier month because as you get into January, we see more of the classic El Nino impacts that are associated with an El Nino. Cooler across the south, much cooler, much warmer towards the north, and again cooler towards the north. So the warm air is kind of sandwiching between the subtropical areas and the North Pole there. So that's pretty interesting. And if you look at February, right, very similar. In fact, the anomalies on both sides are probably stronger, even cooler across the south, even cooler towards the northern United States, and especially Northwest, and obviously cold towards the North Pole. So yeah, notice how January and February are pretty similar in how they play out, versus December is usually kind of an oddball. And let's take a look at the precipitation, right? So, well, first, actually, let's take a look at an average look of all those months put together. You can see January and February, because they were so similar, outweighed the December, and this is what we get overall. Now let's take a look at the precipitation. So for December, you can see pretty darn wet for all those years across a good portion of the country. Few areas drier. Again, an oddball, because if you look at January, it's more of the characteristic El Nino. We have drier across the Midwest, Great Lakes, maybe the northern United States as well. Wetter towards the coastal areas of pretty much the west, south, and east. All along the coastal areas, a bit wetter. And you can see February is also pretty much identical. Drier towards the central part of the country. Here a bit of an in-between, right? But the west and the northwest, the south, the southeast, northeast, all pretty darn warm. Pretty darn wet. And obviously, if you overlay, cooler conditions, right, which this shows during an average El Nino during February and January, and above average precipitation, you could assume that there could be above average snowfall for those areas. Instead of 5 inches for, say, South Carolina, some area in South Carolina, you might see, closer to 10 or whatnot, a good snowstorm. So that is very important, right? And that's why I created these things, because it really gives us a good look at what might come. And you can see the average through December through February of the precipitation shows, again, the more of the January and February pattern. Well, again, the December one completely kind of just is a little bit of an oddball. So that's very interesting to note. It followed both of those characteristics in terms of precip and in terms of temperatures. Now, another piece of my winter forecast that I used is seasonal temperature outlook. So this is by NOAA. This isn't mine, but this is what they predict will be through January, February, or December, January, and February of this upcoming winter. Now, these forecasts always, anyone that looks at them know that they are very biased towards the warmth. Usually, they don't really show a cool side. It's just a warmer side. And to be fair, with the recent years, the winters have been more dominated by warmer areas than cooler air ones, so they're kind of a higher probability of something like this forecast being more true than if they included a giant blue area. But you could see that they are favoring, if there were to be cool weather, probably towards the south, as here are equal chances, and towards the north is warmer. And I agree with this generally. I don't know how expansive this warm air will be, but it's definitely interesting to see their data here. Seasonal precipitation, you can see they're going with more of that characteristic El Nino that we saw based off those maps, right? Wetter towards the south and east, and kind of the coastal areas. They don't really paint the southwest as being too wet. They show equal chances, excluding Arizona and New Mexico, where the southern half of those states States could be actually wetter. And do note that across the northern United States, they paint a below average precipitation picture, which unfortunately, even though I'm a snow lover, I have to agree with it. I do believe that's pretty accurate, at least based on historical El Nino years. Now we look at another piece of weather information. So these are models, right? And because there are, people associate models with being 10, 15 days out. But there are these things called climate models, and these things go out several months. Some of them actually go out almost a year. And we could look at those as well for some decent information about what might be coming into the future. So I think these are updated on a monthly basis. And notice this is what it shows for December. I don't know what this model name is. It's not really important. It's just one of the few climate models that actually, or one of the models that does actually go out this far. This is what it shows for December. Notice a quite of a warmer pattern for much of the United States. Again, I do want to warn, a lot of these climate models have bias towards the warm side. But interestingly enough, despite that strong bias, because I've been using these models for my winter outlook since, 2015, 2016. So I know a few things about these models. They don't really show cool weather blotches far out. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that, it's accurate, because oftentimes, the strong cold winters aren't really pinpointed by these models. But do note that this is what it shows for January. So we see a general cooling trend towards the south and warmer towards the north. But again, I do want to say that for the Northwest, the Northern Plains, this is very marginally above average. It gets more intense up here, but again, this is what the model shows. And you can see in February, this is what this model shows. A complete change and a lot more cool air coming in. So that's interesting how it shows that that's this far out. Typically, again, these models just show pretty much warm all throughout, and normally I just stopped including them into the videos because they're just useless. But in this case, it shows this cool. It's pretty unusual for a model to do this, so maybe that has something to do with February being some sort of a big cold shot for a good portion of the United States. That's certainly possible. Has happened in El Nino patterns. All right, so the winter of 2009-2010, I like this graphic because not only do I believe there's a lot of similarities, obviously between 2009-2010 and this year, because of the El Nino strength is similar, but I do believe this shows a good example of what typically happens in an El Nino pattern and what's some of the outliers, or what could still happen despite it being an El Nino pattern. So what I mean by that is, again, warmer, you can see in those little yellow areas towards the northwest, northeast. That's typical of an El Nino, and I believe that this year will be no different. How much warmer? I don't know. You can see it shows drier weather, drier conditions across, say, Ohio, Indiana, right there, the kind of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. I believe that there will be a certain degree of that accuracy this year as well. But it's important to know that it could vary quite significantly in this area, because the winter of 2009-2010, say for Chicago, I believe was one of the wetter and snowier winters on record, while the general area here was a lot drier. So again, that varies quite a bit. This is an area of kind of United States that typically sees pretty warm temperature during an El Nino, and you can see during the winter of 2009-2010, they saw frequent cold through much of the winter months, actually. So that could still happen despite it being an El Nino. This doesn't necessarily mean that the northern United States will just be guaranteed to see warmth. I do believe there's a heightened chance for you guys to see warmth compared to any other given year. But if there were to be an El Nino like 2009-2010, which, for example, weather forecasting agencies like AccuWeather does believe there's a lot of similarities between this particular winter and the one we have coming up, then, you could be looking at some of these maybe frequent cold events, playing out this year as well. This is something that's usually very consistent with El Ninos. The Southwest, right? I don't know about the mudslides, but very heavy rain across the Southwest, especially kind of the bottom Southwest. So not necessarily towards, Utah or Nevada, but California, Arizona, and the southern half of maybe Utah or Nevada, the big states, right? So that is usually pretty consistent. And these low pressures often produce some heightened level of snow for these areas, because as you saw on the maps that I showed you, during El Nino years, the South is usually pretty darn cold and above average in terms of precipitation. So if you get two of those overlapping, that doesn't mean you'll be seeing snow every day, but you will have a heightened chance of seeing frequent snowstorms producing more snow and ice. So not necessarily good if you're a warm weather lover. And you can see potentially damaging freezes across Florida. That's what happened in 2009-2010. I don't really see that happening this year, but it's definitely a possibility. I mean, usually the southeast is a lot colder during El Nino, so if it were to happen in any year for the next, or out of the past 5 years, this would be the year, right? And something that's also very interesting and has caught my attention, and I'm sure many other weather channels, because I've seen them talking about this on their YouTube channels, is the Mid-Atlantic. So, and it makes sense. So what we have is basically this cold air that is reserved towards the south, kind of southeast here, right? So that plays into a lot of storm development and snowy conditions towards the south, at least compared to average. We see these low pressures traversing across the southwest, often mixing into the Gulf of Mexico and riding up the northeast as these monster storms. So what is interesting, that if you look at 2009, 2010, as it shows right here, some of these areas in the Mid-Atlantic, right, big cities, I mean, I'm talking even Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, any other city that's in there, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, I mean, it's like a huge chunk of the U.S. lives there, right? That year, these cities got 60 to 90 inches of snow in some areas, which is unprecedented. I think the DC's average is like 12 or something for like any given year, so it's pretty, pretty small compared to what they got this year in 2009, 2010. And if you look at 2015, 2016, let's say, or 2016, 2015, 2016, there was also a massive snowstorm that occurred, and it was also a strong El Nino, and that was Winter Storm Jonas. I don't know if you remember, but it dropped like, I think, 3 feet of snow across New York City, almost, Washington, D.C. as well. So that's been a consistent thing as well, that these large, massive winter storms occur across the Mid-Atlantic during these years. And I believe that this year will be no different. I do believe that, if you live across the Mid-Atlantic, there's a heightened chance you will see, actually a very heightened chance you'll see some monster system at one point or another. And so if you're looking to buy some shovels because you don't have any, it's probably good to have a shovel in first place, and especially if it's a year like this, I would recommend that. So this is what I was talking about. This is the 2015-2016 storm, or that happened during those years. Obviously occurred January of 25th of January 2016, and you could see that this thing was a monster. I mean, in terms of the amount of moisture it dropped, and it just dropped a ton of snowfall. So, right, even despite New York City maybe seeing, maybe some warmer conditions on average during an El Nino, all it takes is one of these snowstorms to really trigger and develop itself, and this could result in a mayhem. Obviously, this doesn't have to be a Mid-Atlantic or, coastal hugger. It could be more of a nor'easter dropping heavier snow up here, but notice that consistently, you can see here's another one, February 4th through 7th, 2010. There was another big snowstorm across, again, the Mid-Atlantic areas that dropped a lot of snow. And I believe that in this winter, 2009, 2010, there was also one in December that dropped similar amounts of snow in the DC area, another snowstorm. So, again, I do believe we'll have some events like this. Again, this could be further north a bit, further south, further east, further west. But I do believe there will be something like that. Another thing, this is the one I was talking about, right? December 18th to the 21st of 2009. So that same year, you could see another system that dropped tons of snow. A little bit different oriented, but still, the D.C. Mid-Atlantic area getting absolutely hammered. West Virginia, Northern Virginia, and Delaware, and Maryland, and what's not. Notice that, this is just a picture that I had to show you the El Ninos, and again, 2015, 2016 was a year with a strong El Nino. This year will most likely be the same. Here's a storm that did not necessarily happen across the eastern United States, but it was more across the southern central. This is another characteristic of El Nino years, that it's either a very snowy winter for the southern United States, the Mid-Atlantic, or a lot of ice for the areas even as far north as Chicago and Indiana. And I say this because this particular storm, Winter Storm Goliath, as the Weather Channel called it, which occurred in December 2015, dropped, I think, 2 inches. It was a record, 2 inches of sleet for Chicago. So a lot of these El Nino years tend to be very icy for the central United States. So that's also something very interesting that I noticed. And also in the year 2014, 2015, we saw again, this was a weaker El Nino, right? You could see it wasn't as strong as this year's will be, but it was an El Nino nonetheless, and there was a snowstorm Linus that produced a massive amount of snow across the Midwest and whatnot. So I'm just trying to show you that it seems El Ninos, despite the reputation to get as being warm and whatnot, they could produce some nasty snowstorms. So that is definitely something I wanted to, put my attention towards. And this is a picture of an ice storm that occurred in New England, speaking about that ice, as I was saying, in 1998, which was another strong El Nino year. And you can see this is a picture of it. I mean, some of these areas never recovered for so long because of just how devastating it was. There was inches of ice, and you can see that this is a picture of what occurred during that ice storm, historic ice storm, up to 4 inches in some areas. I mean, you bet that was absolutely devastating. I know there's people in the comments in my previous videos that said they remember this and how just destructive it was and how insane, kind of almost surreal it was. So, yeah, that's another thing I wanted to kind of mention. So my official forecast, where I do think there will be a decent chance for a big snowstorm. Now, obviously, this could go further north or whatnot, right? But again, historically, based on looking what happened in the past, I do believe that somewhere in this pink area, there's a significantly heightened chance for a big snowstorm potential. Now, anywhere elsewhere, again, obviously there could be a snowstorm, but this is kind of the one that will probably take headlines if there were to, the one that does occur, and I believe that it's going to occur somewhere in this area, which historically it has during these El Nino years. So that's one thing I wanted to include. These are my temperature outlooks. So again, I think it'll be warmer by quite a bit across the northern United States and northern plains. How far or how expansive this is, I don't know. Obviously, there could be brief cold shots of air like we saw in the winter of 2009, 2010, but the winter could still be overall warm. Now, there could be a lot of cold shots of air making this colder, right? I mean, I don't have the facility to predict that. No one does. But based on historical years, I'm pretty confident with producing this. I believe the Northeast will also be dealing with some warmer than average conditions. However, again, this doesn't mean that there can't be a snowstorm. I mean, New York City, for goodness sake, could be well above average. All it takes is one snowstorm drops 30 inches of snow in a month that is still above average, and you're not going to remember it for being above average in terms of temperatures, but for that big snowstorm. Notice an area that I do believe will be cooler, not necessarily because of, I guess high pressures and low pressures driving cold air down, but more or less because of just the sheer amount of cloudiness that these low pressures will bring and cause. But again, I think the bigger story for these areas will just be the wetness caused and snowiness in the mountains caused by the El Nino here. And anywhere in between here, I don't know. It's either it will be warmer or cooler. It's kind of a battle zone, right, for Utah, Nevada, northern areas of those states. And then, of course, the south, I do believe, will be cooler. This is, again, not only to do with the persistent cloudiness, but also just the storminess, these low pressures moving out, and each time they move out, they're bringing cooler air behind it. So I do believe snow, there's a heightened chance for that, and obviously just colder conditions, which need to be present in order for it to snow. So this is overall my average snowfall kind of outlook. I do believe areas in the red will see below average snowfall. Now, this isn't obviously set in stone. There will be areas in here that probably do see above average. Maybe it will be an above average lake effect season. Who knows? But I do believe overall, if I were a betting man, which this is what this kind of winter outlook is, it's kind of like a bet on this winter, I do believe below average snowfall conditions would occur in these areas. Above average, and you're in that blue. So you can see it's pretty expansive, but it covers, pretty much the coastal areas where it's both cooler and wetter on a typical El Nino year. And anywhere in between, it could go both ways. I have no clue. During El Nino years, it typically varies, right? 2015, 2016 saw a lot of snow across the panhandles here, and in other years there was a lot less. So it varies. And this is kind of my official winter outlook, and what I think each area will be like most well remembered for this winter. I think dry and warm across the northern United States, that will be the main one. Obviously, there is an unfortunate area of uncertain for most of the United States here. That's because, well, I don't think every area will be profoundly remembered by stuff, and also, I don't know how expansive this dry or warm air will be. I don't know how expansive this snowy and wet will be. But I do believe that the snowy and wet will be predominant in at least a portion of the Southwest, and that's what it will be remembered for. This is good news for the reservoirs and whatnot. Notice, as I mentioned with those ice storms, I believe that a good chunk of the United States will be icy, and there could be a heightened chance for some ice storms, even as far north as, again, the Northeast, as we saw in 1998 with an El Nino year, one that dropped tons of ice all the way up the Canadian border, areas that you typically associate with, snow and not necessarily ice, which you need warmer conditions for that. Now, the Southeast where things get interesting. Notice, I do believe there will be wet conditions predominantly across the extreme Southeast. There could be some snow mixing in here, but again, let's be real. No matter how cold it gets, it's most likely or not that, these areas will see rain, not snow. So I believe that a lot of these areas will see a lot of rain from these active nor'easters and systems, and also maybe some enhanced severe weather. Cold is another one that is obviously going to be pretty profound for much of these areas, not just in this blue, but also probably in the pink and even in the red. I just wanted to make my statement here clear. I believe it will be more targeted towards the south and east. And then, of course, that big snows. I think that's a big potential area for the Mid-Atlantic and whatnot here. I think that's a big pattern that could take hold and drop several big snowstorms there. So that's basically it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully you got a better idea of what you guys may be looking at. And I'll catch you all guys on the next episode. See ya.